Part 1. The Price of Solitude. The wind was a living thing in Sage Creek, Wyoming. It was born in the jagged teeth of the distant mountains and came shrieking across the plains with no tree or hill to slow its rage. It scoured the land, peeling the paint from lonely cabins and piling snow into drifts as high as a horse's back. In the heart of that white desolation, in the dead of the winter of 1879, Ethan Cole's world had shrunk to the 4 log walls of his home and the sound of a baby's cry. It was a weak, fretful sound, thin as a thread, and it frayed the edges of his sanity. Ethan stood by the single frosted window, his broad shoulders slumped in a way that defied his very nature. He was a man built of rawhide and resolve, his face a map of long days under a punishing sun. His hands calloused and capable from wrestling life from this unforgiving soil. He could set a broken leg on a calf, track a wolf for miles, and read the coming of a blizzard in the color of the sky. But he could not make his own daughter eat. He turned from the window, the endless white outside offering no answers. In the center of the room, a crude cradle sat near the hearth. Inside, bundled in layers of wool, was Grace, 3 months old, all he had left of Sarah. Her face was pale and pinched, her tiny rosebud mouth puckered in a constant, miserable complaint. Her cry was not the robust, lung-testing wail of a healthy infant, but a piteous mewling that spoke of a deep, hollow ache, an ache Ethan felt in his own gut. On the rough-hewn table sat the evidence of his failure, a tin cup of goat's milk, now cold. He'd spent the better part of the morning coaxing the thin, bluish liquid from their stubborn nanny goat, his frozen fingers fumbling with the task. He'd warmed it by the fire, just as the doctor's wife in town had instructed on his last desperate trip for supplies. He'd dipped a clean strip of linen in it, trying to drip it into Grace's mouth. She had turned her head away, her little body stiffening in protest. The milk dribbled down her chin, wasted. When he'd tried a small, whittled spoon, she choked and gagged until her cries were strangled gasps that clawed at his heart. The goat's milk, their only hope, was a poison to her. "Come on now, Gracie," he whispered, his voice a low rumble of exhaustion. He picked her up, her weight terrifyingly slight in his massive arms. She felt like a bird, all fragile bones and fluttering pulse. "You gotta eat. For your PA, please." She didn't stop crying. He paced the floor of the small cabin, the worn floorboards groaning under his boots. Each step was a familiar journey through a landscape of grief. There was the rocking chair by the fire, its wood smooth and dark from Sarah's touch. She had sat there for hours while she was carrying Grace, her hands busy with a needle, humming softly. Now it sat empty, a silent accusation. On the wall hung a half-finished quilt, a pattern of sunbursts and prairie flowers frozen in time, its threads still dangling from the needle Sarah had pushed through the fabric one last time. The whole cabin felt empty. It was more than the silence where her laughter used to be. It was a physical cold that the fire in the hearth could not touch. The fire itself seemed to understand. It was a sullen, meager thing, a cluster of embers that hissed and spat but gave off little warmth and even less light. It was a fire of survival, not of comfort. Just like him, just like Grace, they were surviving, moment by agonizing moment, but they were not living. He looked down at his daughter's face. She had Sarah's eyes, a deep, stormy blue that, even now, seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond her months. When she was first born, in the golden light of late summer, those eyes had sparkled. He and Sarah had marveled at her, this perfect little creature they had made. "She's got your chin, Ethan," Sarah had laughed, her voice weak but full of joy. "Stubborn as a mule, I reckon, The memory was a knife twist. Sarah had been right. Grace was stubborn. She had stubbornly refused to fade away in the first weeks after the fever took her mother. She had stubbornly held on to life, a tiny, fierce anchor in the swirling chaos of his grief. And now, she was stubbornly refusing to live. He tried the milk again. He sat in the dreaded rocking chair, forcing himself into the space she had left, and held Grace against his chest. He could feel the frantic, feeble beat of her heart against his ribs. "Just a little sweet girl," he begged, his voice cracking. "It's not so bad." He brought the milk-soaked rag to her lips. She squirmed, her cry rising in pitch, a thin, desperate wail of rejection. He felt a surge of hot, helpless anger rise in his chest. It wasn't directed at her. It was at the goat, at the snow, at the miles of wilderness that separated him from anyone who might know what to do. It was aimed at God, at a heaven that would give him such a perfect gift, only to leave him completely unequipped to keep it. He put the cup down with a clatter, sloshing milk onto the floor. The sound startled Grace, and her cries hitched into terrified sobs. Shame washed over him, cold and immediate. He pulled her close, burying his face in her swaddling, his own shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Pa's sorry." He was a rancher. He knew the rhythms of life and death. He'd seen it in calves born too soon, in livestock taken by wolves, in the stark, unforgiving balance of nature. A weak thing did not last long in this country. The thought was a violation, a betrayal of his daughter. But it circled him like a vulture. The West was a crucible. It burned away weakness. Was his love for his daughter a weakness, or was his inability to save her the ultimate proof of his own? The afternoon light began to fail. The sky outside the window turning from a flat, oppressive white to a bruised purple-gray. The wind picked up, howling a mournful song around the corners of the cabin, rattling the door in its frame. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel vast and haunted. Ethan laid Grace back in her cradle. She had cried herself into a fitful, exhausted sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her skin had a bluish tint around her lips that sent a fresh spear of terror through him. He knelt beside her, his large, rough hand hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid she might just crumble into dust. He had talked to her for hours, telling her stories about her mother. He told her how Sarah could tame the wildest colt with a soft word and a patient hand. He told her how she loved the smell of rain on sagebrush, and how her laugh could make a whole field of sunflowers turn their heads. He was trying to weave a bond between them, to anchor Grace to a world that her mother had been forced to leave. But he felt his words dissipating into the cold air, unheard. He was failing. The stark truth of it settled in his bones, heavier than the snow piling up against the door. He had promised Sarah, in those last, fevered hours. He had held her hand and sworn he would protect their child, that he would raise her to be as strong and good as her mother. The promise was turning to ash in his mouth. He rose and walked back to the hearth, adding another log to the dying embers. He had to keep the fire going. It was a primal, instinctual act. As long as the fire burned, there was a chance. He stared into the weak flames, his reflection a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger. How long had it been since he'd slept more than an hour at a time? How long since he'd eaten a proper meal he couldn't remember? His own needs had faded into the background, consumed entirely by the overwhelming, all-encompassing need of his child. The cabin was a prison of his own making, built with love and sealed by grief. Outside, the world was being buried in a fresh blanket of snow. There would be no getting to town, not for days. They were alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. The weight of it was crushing. It was the price of building a life out here, on the edge of everything. You were rewarded with a brutal, beautiful freedom, but you paid for it with every ounce of your strength. And when your strength ran out, the land took it all back. A small whimper came from the cradle. Grace was stirring. Ethan's entire body tensed. The cycle was about to begin again, the weak cry, The futile attempt at feeding, the desperate pacing, the crushing despair. He felt a weariness so profound it was almost a physical blow, threatening to buckle his knees. Hope was a flickering ember, and the cold, relentless wind of reality was blowing it out. He closed his eyes, a prayer forming on his lips, a prayer with no words, just a raw, desperate plea sent out into the vast, indifferent silence of the Wyoming winter. He didn't know how much longer they could go on. Part 2. The knock at the door in the storm. The prayer, if it could be called that, was answered not by a voice from the heavens, but by a fist against his door. Night had fallen completely, a thick, smothering blackness that was indistinguishable from the storm. The wind had become a physical force, a battering ram that slammed against the cabin and screamed down the chimney, making the embers in the hearth dance and spit. Snow drove against the window pane with the sound of thrown sand. Inside, the world had once again resolved into the thin, reedy cry of a starving child. Grace was awake, and her whimpers were weaker now, a sound that terrified Ethan more than any shriek. It was the sound of a life giving up. He was holding her, walking the floor in a trance of despair, when the sound came. Thump, thump, thump. It was sharp, solid, and utterly alien in the symphony of the storm. Ethan froze mid-stride. He must have imagined it. A branch, heavy with ice, crashing against the wall. He stood perfectly still, listening, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. The only sounds were the wind and Grace's pathetic cry. He had been alone for too long. The solitude was making him hear things. Thump, thump, thump. Louder this time, insistent, unmistakably human. A cold dread, colder than the wind, snaked up his spine. No sane person would be out in this blizzard. A traveler lost, perhaps, or something worse. This land was full of desperate men who would see the faint light of his lamp as a beacon of opportunity. He gently laid the crying Grace back in her cradle, his movements swift and silent. He reached above the mantelpiece and took down the heavy Winchester rifle, its cool, oiled steel a familiar and grim comfort in his hands. He checked the action. It was loaded. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The only answer was the shriek of the wind, but then a voice, thin and torn to shreds by the gale, filtered through the wood. "Please help!" It was a woman. All thought of danger vanished, replaced by a primal instinct to aid. He unlatched the heavy bar securing the door. The moment he cracked it open, the storm burst in. A ferocious blast of wind and needle-sharp snow tore into the room, extinguishing the lamp on the table and sending sparks flying from the hearth. The door was ripped from his grasp and thrown wide open. Framed for a moment in the maelstrom of swirling white was a figure, a human shape crusted with snow. Then it stumbled forward and collapsed onto the cabin floor in a heap of wet wool and exhaustion. Ethan shoved his shoulder against the door, fighting the storm's fury to force it shut, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. He dropped the bar back across it, sealing them inside. The relative silence that followed was deafening. The only light came from the now roaring fire, stoked by the sudden draft. On the floor lay a woman. She was small, curled in on herself, shivering violently. A dark, sodden cloak was wrapped around her, and a small, leather satchel was clutched in her frozen hands. Ethan knelt beside her, the rifle momentarily forgotten. Ma'am, can you hear me?" She stirred, pushing back a hood caked with ice. The firelight flickered across a face that was young, but etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. Her skin was deathly pale, her lips a faint blue. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, were wide with a haunted, desperate light. "Cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard the word was barely intelligible. Ethan acted without thinking. He scooped her up. She weighed next to nothing and carried her to the hearth. He sat her down on the bearskin rug, her back against the warm stones. Her cloak was a shell of ice and wet fabric, and he knew it was draining what little warmth she had left. "I need to get this off you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You'll freeze solid in it." She nodded weakly, her eyes already starting to glaze over. He worked the frozen clasps with his clumsy fingers, finally pulling the heavy cloak away. Underneath, her dress was soaked through as well. She was shivering uncontrollably. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from his own bed, one of Sarah's, and wrapped it tightly around her trembling shoulders. He then moved to the stove, pouring the last of his coffee into a mug and setting it in the embers to warm. It was then that Grace's cry, which had subsided into a whimper at the intrusion, started again in earnest. It was a miserable, hopeless sound, and a flicker of shame and failure crossed Ethan's face. The woman's head snapped up. Her dazed, exhausted expression sharpened, focusing with an unnerving intensity on the cradle. All her own misery seemed to fall away, replaced by an instinct that was as powerful and raw as the storm outside. She stared at the source of the cry, her gaze fixed, her body rigid. Ethan saw the look and misunderstood. "It's my daughter," he said gruffly, a defensive edge to his voice. She's not well." He brought the warm coffee to her, pressing the mug into her hands. She took it, but she didn't drink. Her eyes darted from the cradle to the small tin cup of cold goat's milk on the table, then to Ethan's own haggard face. In the space of a heartbeat, her expression changed from haunted weariness to a dawning, heartbreaking comprehension. She saw it all: the empty rocking chair, the man's exhaustion, the baby's weak cry, the useless milk. She looked down at her own hands, then at the front of her dress, a movement so subtle Ethan almost missed it. A wave of profound, gut-wrenching pain washed over her features. Her lips trembled. "How old is she?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. 3 months, Ethan answered, turning away to stir the fire. He couldn't bear to look at her, a stranger, and admit the totality of his failure. Her mother. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Passed, a fever, just after she was born." The words were stones in his throat. The woman closed her eyes. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. When she opened them again, they held a terrible resolve. She set the coffee mug down, her movements slow and deliberate. "The goat's milk," she stated, "not a question. She won't take it." Ethan's shoulders sagged. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The woman took a deep, shuddering breath. "I can help her," she said, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost to the fire's crackle. Ethan turned, frowning. "How, there's nothing to be done?" the doctor's wife said. "I can feed her," the woman interrupted, her gaze direct and unwavering. The intensity in her eyes silenced him. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself. I had a son. He was born this past autumn." Her voice broke, and she fought to control it. He took sick a month ago. He didn't survive." The confession filled the small cabin, a grief so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Ethan stared at her, his own loss echoing in her words. He understood the haunted look in her eyes now. It was the same one he saw in his own reflection. "But my milk," she continued, her voice trembling as she laid her secret bare. It hasn't gone yet. It's still here." The world tilted on its axis. Ethan felt a roaring in his ears. He looked from this strange, shattered woman to his own child, whose cries were now fading into exhausted, breathless gasps. A stranger. A woman who had walked out of a blizzard like some ghost of the plains, carrying a grief that mirrored his own, and she was offering life. It was impossible. It was a miracle wrapped in a tragedy. His mind rebelled. The intimacy of what she was suggesting was staggering. To let a stranger, but then he looked at Grace. He saw the faint blue tinge to her skin, the hollows in her cheeks. He remembered his promise to Sarah, He would do anything, anything. He couldn't speak. He could only give a single, jerky nod. The woman, who he didn't even know the name of, seemed to understand. An expression of profound sadness and purpose settled on her face. This was not an act of charity. It was a sacrament, a way to give the gift she could no longer give her own child. Ethan, his movements stiff, picked up a clean, dry blanket from the foot of his bed. He walked over to the rocking chair, Sarah's chair, and draped the blanket over its back. He didn't say a word, but the gesture was clear. It was an offering, an acceptance. He turned his back, affording her a privacy the small cabin could not otherwise provide. He walked to the window, staring out into the black, swirling chaos. But he wasn't seeing it. He was listening with every fiber of his being. He heard her rise and move to the cradle. He heard the soft rustle of wool as she settled into the rocking chair. He heard her murmuring, soft, cooing sounds, the universal language of a mother. Then he heard Grace's fretful cry, closer now. There was a moment of silence, a tense, breathless pause where Ethan's heart seemed to stop. And then the crying stopped. It didn't just trail off. It cut off abruptly. It was replaced by a new sound, a soft, rhythmic, gulping sound, a sound of contented, desperate suckling. The sound of life. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window pane, and his shoulders began to shake. A dry, silent sob racked his body. It was a sound he hadn't made since Sarah died. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a hope he hadn't even dared to acknowledge being miraculously, painfully resurrected. That small, greedy sound coming from the rocking chair was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. It was the sound of his promise being kept. After what seemed like an eternity, he heard a soft sigh. He turned around. The woman was sitting in the rocking chair, her head bent over the bundle in her arms. Grace was asleep, her face peaceful and slack, a tiny bead of white milk on her upper lip. For the first time in weeks, she looked content. She looked full. The woman's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, an immense, aching tenderness mixed with a sorrow so deep it was bottomless. She was looking at Grace, but she was seeing the son she had lost. Ethan's throat was thick. "Thank you," he rasped. It was a wholly inadequate word. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "My name is Clara," she said softly. "Clara Bennett." Ethan Cole. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The only sounds, the howl of the storm outside and the crackle of the fire within. The air in the cabin had changed. The crushing weight of solitude had lifted, replaced by a fragile, shared stillness. Two strangers, two survivors, shipwrecked by their own private storms, had washed up on the same desolate shore, and between them, in a cradle by the fire, a baby girl slept, nourished by a stranger's grief and a father's last, desperate prayer. Salvation had knocked on his door in the heart of the blizzard. Part 3. A temporary home. Old wounds. The morning broke in a silent, blinding glare. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world remade in its image, a pristine, unforgiving expanse of white under a sky of pale, washed-out blue. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. Inside the cabin, the quiet was of a different sort. It was the peaceful, rhythmic sound of a baby breathing, deep and untroubled. Ethan had not slept. He had dozed fitfully in his straight-backed chair, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him, his body a knot of tension. He'd woken with a start every hour, his first panicked thought for Grace, only to be soothed by the near imperceptible sound of her sleeping. When the first light crept through the window, he saw Clara. She was already awake, sitting on the bearskin rug by the hearth, her back straight, watching the cradle. The blanket was still wrapped around her shoulders, but she had hung her wet clothes on a line strung near the fire. A small, practical act of claiming space. She looked up and their eyes met. A wave of awkwardness, thick and uncomfortable, filled the small room. The desperate clarity of the night before survival. Salvation had receded with the storm, leaving behind the complicated reality of the morning after. She was a stranger who had saved his child. He was a stranger who had taken her in. Neither of them knew the rules for what came next. "She slept," Ethan said, his voice a gravelly whisper. It felt like the first words spoken in a new world. "Like a stone," Clara replied, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. "She's strong." The words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of how close she had come to not being strong at all. An unspoken agreement was being forged in the silence. Grace would need to eat again soon, and again after that. The storm had passed, but the world outside was impassable. There was nowhere for Clara to go, and nowhere Ethan could turn for help. He broke the stillness, moving to the stove. "I'll make coffee," he offered. "There's bacon, some flour for biscuits." It was an invitation, a practical solution to an impossibly delicate problem. By accepting a plate, she would be accepting a place here. For now. She simply nodded, turning her attention back to the cradle as Grace began to stir. The days that followed fell into a strange, cautious rhythm. Their lives, which had been spiraling in isolation, began to orbit around the small, demanding center of the baby. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate grace, their conversation sparse and functional, limited to the necessities of life. The woodpile's low. The water bucket needs filling. She likes it when you hum that tune. On the third day, Ethan acted. He went to the small lean-to where he kept his tools and spare lumber, and with the clean, efficient motions of a man accustomed to building things to last, he began to construct a bed. He worked outside in the cold, bright sun, the sound of his saw and hammer strokes ringing out in the vast silence. He wasn't building a piece of furniture. He was defining a boundary. He was creating a space for Clara that was hers. But that was also separate. It was a gesture of respect, and a quiet insistence that this arrangement, this miracle, was temporary. He set it up in the far corner of the cabin, away from his own bunk, and laid a spare mattress stuffed with corn husks upon it. Clara watched him, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she walked over and ran a hand over the smooth, planed wood. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his name since that first night. With that, their temporary home was established. Life, stripped to its barest essentials, took over. Ethan's days were spent outside. He dug paths through the snow to the barn and the chicken coop, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He tended to his small herd of cattle, forking hay into their trough, his movements economical and strong. He took his rifle and disappeared into the stark, white woods for hours, returning with a rabbit or two slung over his shoulder. This was his domain. The cold, the labor, the quiet violence of survival. It was a world he understood. Clara's world became the warm, fire-lit cabin. She transformed it subtly, almost without intention. The air, which for months had smelled of wood smoke, old grief, and sour milk, now carried the scent of baking bread. She found Sarah's sewing basket and, with quiet reverence, began to work on the unfinished quilt, her stitches small and neat alongside Sarah's. She washed Grace's few small garments in a basin of heated snowmelt and hung them to dry by the fire, a string of tiny flags proclaiming life in the face of so much loss. And she cared for Grace. She nursed her, bathed her, and rocked her to sleep in the chair that had sat empty for so long. She would hum low, forgotten lullabies, her voice soft and sweet, for Ethan. Hearing that sound was both a profound comfort and a sharp, painful sting. It was the sound of a mother, But it was not the right mother. It was a constant reminder of all that he had, and all that he had lost. They were two solitary planets, held in a fragile orbit by the gravity of a child. They ate their meals together at the small table, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with the unspoken thoughts of their pasts. They were ghosts at their own table, sharing their stew with the specters of a dead wife and a lost son. The first crack in that careful silence came one evening about a week after her arrival. The fire was burning brightly, and Clara was rocking a milk-drunk Grace, her fingers tracing the sunburst pattern on the quilt draped over her lap. "She must have loved bright colors," Clara said, her voice soft. Ethan looked up from the harness he was mending. He followed her gaze to the quilt. His throat felt tight. "Sarah," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. That was her name. She did. She said there was enough gray in the world without inviting it inside. He paused, then found himself continuing, the words coming easier than he expected. "She planned to hang that over the cradle. She said Grace should wake up to a sunrise, even on cloudy days." It was the most he had spoken of his wife since she had died. Sharing the memory felt like letting a little light into a dark, shuttered room. Clara didn't press him for more. She simply nodded, her eyes full of a deep, sad understanding. Her own moment came a few days later. Grace, lying on a blanket by the fire, let out a small, gurgling laugh for the first time. It was a delightful, surprising sound. Ethan felt a smile tug at his own lips, the first in months. But when he looked at Clara, he saw that her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with a look of raw pain. She quickly turned away, but not before he saw the tears welling. That night, after Grace was asleep, Clara spoke into the quiet. "His name was Thomas," she said, her voice thick. "My boy, he was so serious. He never laughed. Not really. He just watched everything with these big dark eyes, like he was trying to figure out the whole world before he'd even left the cradle." She wrapped her arms around herself. "When the sickness took him, it was fast. He was gone before I ever got to hear him laugh." Now their ghosts had names, Sarah and Thomas. They existed in the cabin with them, their presence a constant, silent hum beneath the surface of their new life. By speaking their names, Ethan and Clara had given each other a piece of their broken heart to hold. But this new intimacy, this profound dependence, bred a new kind of fear. Ethan would watch Clara with Grace, a fierce, protective gratitude swelling in his chest. He saw the bond forming between them, saw the way Grace turned her head toward the sound of Clara's voice, the way her tiny hand would grip Clara's finger, and a cold terror would grip him. He had built his world around Sarah, and it had crumbled. Now, this stranger was the pillar holding up what was left. What if she decided to leave when the snows thawed? What if some harm came to her? The thought of being thrown back into that black pit of despair was a physical torment, and it made him guarded. His words sometimes clipped and harsh without reason. Clara felt it too. Every moment she spent with Grace was a healing balm on the raw wound of her own loss. Holding this warm, living child in her arms was a bittersweet miracle, but she knew it was a borrowed joy. This was not her daughter. This was not her home. She was a temporary fix, a wet nurse, a ghost mother. The love she felt for Grace grew more fierce and true each day, and with it grew the terrifying certainty that leaving her would be like losing Thomas all over again. This fear made her hold back a part of herself, a quiet reserve that kept a wall around her heart. They were bound by need and terrified by it. One night, Ethan woke to a sound. It was Clara, humming the lullaby, but her voice was choked with sobs. He lay in his bunk, listening to the sound of her quiet, desperate weeping in the darkness. He knew she was not just crying for the son she had lost, but for the daughter she was terrified to love, and he knew his own fear was a mirror of hers. They were two people who had lost everything, now clinging to a temporary reprieve, achingly aware that the very thing saving them was also setting them up for a new, unbearable heartbreak. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing coals, and in the deep, shared darkness of the cabin, their old wounds lay open and exposed. Part 4. The cold wind of rumor spring came to Wyoming not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, violent thaw. The world, frozen for months in a state of suspended animation, began to bleed. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, carving rivulets through the dirty, shrinking snowdrifts. The creek, choked with ice, groaned and cracked, its powerful current finally breaking free with a roar for Ethan and Clara. The sound was not one of liberation, but of a coming siege. The snow had been a fortress, insulating their fragile world from judgment. Now, the walls were melting. The path to Sage Creek became a treacherous ribbon of mud, but it was a path nonetheless. Their supplies, stretched thin through the long winter, were dwindling to near nothing. The trip could no longer be postponed. "I'll go," Ethan announced one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We need flour, salt, and coffee, and Grace needs things." The unspoken word hung in the air. Cloth. The baby was growing, and Clara had been forced to cut up one of her own petticoats for swaddling. The thought of Ethan, this mountain of a man, walking into the general store to buy yards of soft flannel was a stark illustration of their strange reality. A new anxiety, different from the fear of starvation or loss, settled in the cabin after he left. The small space, which had felt so confining, now seemed a precious sanctuary. Clara held Grace close, pacing the floor as Ethan had once done, seeing the outside world not as a promise of connection, but as a threat. In Sage Creek, Ethan felt the change the moment he tied his horse to the hitching post outside Gable's Mercantile. The usual nods from men lounging on the boardwalk were hesitant, their eyes sliding away from his. Inside, the familiar smell of burlap, leather, and dried apples was tainted with something else, a simmering, watchful curiosity. Martha Gable, a woman whose face was a permanent knot of pious disapproval, was behind the counter. She had known Sarah, had offered condolences with a dry eye and a plate of stale biscuits after the funeral. "Ethan," she said, her voice thin, "the thaw treats you well." "It treats me the same as everyone, Martha," he replied, placing his list on the counter. Her eyes scanned the items, lingering on the 10 yards of white flannel. "For the little one, I presume she's thriving." "She is. We heard you had help out at your place," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "A woman from out of town." Ethan's jaw tightened. He said nothing, his silence a wall of granite. But his silence was an answer in itself. "It's a blessing, I'm sure, Mrs." Gable added, a sour twist to her lips that belied the sentiment, "that the Lord provides in our time of need, though he does sometimes work in mysterious ways." The poison had been administered. By the time Ethan had loaded his supplies and walked toward the saloon for a single, fortifying whiskey, the story was already taking flight. It was a cold wind. That rumor, invisible but carrying a bitter chill. It slipped through the cracks in the walls of the saloon, across the sewing circle at the church, and over the fences between neighbors. Ethan Cole, that poor man, hasn't even waited a season to replace his wife. Took in some traveling woman. No one knows where she came from. They say she's trading her milk for a roof and a bed. The words, whispered behind hands and overturned shoulders, were uglier, baser, than the truth. They painted Clara as a conniving opportunist and him as a man lost to lust and disrespect for the dead. He returned to the cabin with his jaw set like iron and a darkness in his eyes that Clara had not seen before. He didn't tell her what was said, believing he was protecting her. But the cold wind had followed him home. The easy, quiet rhythm they had found was gone, replaced by a tense, brittle silence. He became more withdrawn. His answers to her questions clipped. He was caught in a trap. To defend her would be to admit the town's business was his. inviting more scrutiny. To stay silent felt like a betrayal of the woman who had saved his daughter's life. Clara was not foolish. She felt the chill between them, saw the way he avoided her eyes. She knew its source must be the town. Against his wishes, she insisted that she would be the one to go for the next supplies. "I need to feel the sun," she'd said, a simple excuse for a complex need. She had to face the whispers herself to know the shape of the monster that was haunting their home. Her walk into Sage Creek was a gauntlet. The very air seemed to prickle with judgment. Women who would have once nodded a polite hello now turned to inspect goods in a shop window as she passed. She saw the whispers break off as she approached, only to resume the moment her back was turned. At the Mercantile, a group of women fell silent as she entered, their eyes raking over her worn dress, her tired face. One of them, a woman named Beatrice, spoke into the silence, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "Some people have no decency, worming their way into a good man's home when his wife is barely cold in the ground." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. She bought her items with trembling hands, her shame a hot, burning coal in her chest. The town's scorn was a confirmation of her own deepest, darkest fears. She was an imposter, a fraud. The love she felt for Grace, so pure and fierce within the cabin walls, felt tainted and sordid out here. Was she disrespecting the memory of the sainted Sarah? Was she a parasite, feeding her own broken heart on another family's tragedy? The self-recrimination was relentless. She began to pull away, her movements around Ethan becoming more formal, her touch with Grace almost fearful, as if she were contaminating the child with her unworthiness. The breaking point came a week later. Mrs. Gable, seeing Clara alone outside the store, approached her under the guise of Christian concern. "My dear," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I worry about you, and I worry for that poor child." "Grace is well, thank you," Clara said, her voice tight. "Oh, I'm sure she is, for now, Mrs. Gable pressed on, lowering her voice. "But the ladies in the church, they are talking. They say a child needs a proper, respectable home. That a baby raised in such a delicate situation, well, it can leave a mark on her soul." She patted Clara's arm, her touch cold as a snake. "There's talk that a good, church-going family might be a better option, for the child's sake, of course, to see her placed somewhere stable." That was it, the final, unbearable turn of the screw. The whispers were no longer just about her reputation. They were a threat. The townsfolk, in their righteous judgment, might try to take Grace away. Not from her, she knew she had no claim, but from Ethan. Her presence, the very act of love that had saved Grace's life, was now the thing that could cause him to lose his daughter forever. The thought became a terrifying, obsessive refrain in her mind. "I am the danger. I am the reason they will take her." That night, the weather turned. A freak late spring storm blew in from the mountains, a sudden, violent relapse into the depths of winter. The wind howled with the same fury as it had the night she arrived, rattling the cabin, flinging icy snow against the window. To Clara, in her panicked state, it felt like an omen, a path opening, a way out. Her logic, twisted by fear and grief, saw only one solution. She had to disappear. If she was gone, the scandal was gone. Ethan would be just a grieving widower again. A figure of pity, not scorn. No one would have cause to take his daughter, while Ethan slept the heavy sleep of an exhausted man. She moved with the silent, desperate urgency of a hunted animal. Her hands trembled as she bundled a sleeping Grace in layer after layer of wool and blankets, leaving only a small opening for her to breathe. She dressed in her own threadbare cloak, the one she'd arrived in. She took nothing else, save for the small satchel containing the few mementos of her son, Thomas. To take anything more would be to admit she had ever belonged here. She stood over the cradle for a moment, her heart breaking. She pressed a kiss to Grace's warm forehead, a tear falling onto the baby's cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the sleeping child. "This is the only way." Then, with one last, agonized look at the man sleeping in the bunk across the room, she unbarred the door. A blast of wind and snow rushed in, a mirror of her arrival. She slipped out into the raging storm, pulling the door quietly shut behind her. She disappeared into the swirling white, a ghost leaving a home she was never meant to have, sacrificing her own heart in a desperate, broken attempt to save the family she had grown to love. Part 5. On the Brink of Despair. It was the cold that woke him, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the dying embers in the hearth. It was a draft, a current of frigid air snaking across the cabin floor, raising the hairs on his arms. Ethan's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn gloom. The storm was still raging outside, a wild, malevolent beast throwing itself against the walls of the cabin, but inside there was a new, terrifying silence. He sat bolt upright in his bunk, his senses on high alert. The normal, soft sounds of the night were gone. He couldn't hear the gentle rustle of Clara turning in her bed. He couldn't hear the faint, milky sighs of Grace sleeping in her cradle. The cradle. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet hitting the icy floorboards. The fire was a dull, red eye, casting just enough light to see the impossible. The cradle was empty. A raw, primal fear, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced his gut. "Clara!" he called out, his voice a harsh rasp in the stillness. No answer. He strode across the room. Her bed, neatly made, was empty and cold to the touch. Her small satchel was gone from the peg where it always hung. Then he saw the door. The heavy wooden bar was not in its place. It was leaning against the wall, and a thin, vertical line of white showed where the wind had forced the door slightly ajar, letting the storm seep in. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. She was gone, and she had taken Grace. For a moment, he was paralyzed, his mind unable to process the sheer insanity of it. To go out in this, it wasn't a departure. It was a death sentence. His mind raced back through the past days, the tension after his trip to town, the haunted look in Clara's eyes after her own visit, the way she had grown quiet and withdrawn. He remembered the venom in Martha Gable's voice, the sideways glances from the men in the saloon, the whispers, the poison. There's talk that a good, church-going family might be a better option. He hadn't heard the words, but he understood the sentiment. And now, he knew with a sickening certainty that they hadn't just gossiped about her. They had threatened her. They had threatened Grace. And this was her terrified, broken response. She wasn't fleeing him. She was fleeing a world that saw her kindness as a sin, and she was trying to remove the perceived stain of her presence from his life, and from Grace's. A volcanic rage erupted in his chest, so hot and fierce it momentarily burned away the fear. A rage at the pious, cruel gossips in town. A rage at a world that could twist an act of salvation into something sordid. A rage at himself for not seeing how deep the poison had gone, for not protecting her from it. But the rage was a luxury he couldn't afford. Panic, cold and absolute, took its place every second he stood here. They were out there, freezing, dying. He moved with a frantic, desperate efficiency. He pulled on his heaviest boots, his thickest wool coat, his gloves. He shoved a loaf of bread and a canteen of water into a saddlebag. Not for him, but for her. If he found her in time, he grabbed every spare blanket he owned. Lastly, he took his rifle. The storm was not the only predator in these woods. The barn was a maelstrom of wind and shrieking timbers when he forced the door open. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, whinnied nervously in his stall, his eyes wide in the lantern light. "Easy, boy, easy," Ethan murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble that belied the frantic terror hammering in his chest. His fingers, numb with cold and haste, fumbled with the bridle and saddle. He worked by instinct, his body performing the familiar tasks while his mind raced, trying to think like her. Where would she go? Not west, toward town. She was running from that. North and south were endless, open plains, a white desert where the storm would tear her apart in minutes. That left east, toward the broken country, the rolling hills and pine-covered ridges that offered the only chance of shelter. It was wilder, more dangerous country, but it was a way. It was escape. He swung himself into the saddle, pulling his hat down low and wrapping a scarf around the lower half of his face. He leaned forward, speaking into Buck's ear. "Find them, boy! You find them!" He spurred the horse out of the barn and into the blizzard. It was like riding into a churning sea of milk. The world was reduced to a swirling vortex of white, the wind a physical blow that threatened to tear him from the saddle. Snow, driven almost horizontal, stung his exposed cheeks and eyelashes, freezing instantly. He could see no more than 10 feet in any direction. There were no tracks, no sign of passage. The storm erased everything. He gave Buck his head, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own. He pushed eastward, his eyes scanning the blur of white for any shape that was not a snow-laden tree or a half-buried rock. He shouted her name, his voice ripped from his throat and swallowed by the gale. Clara. The only answer was the howl of the wind. An hour passed, then another. The cold was a living entity, seeping through his layers of wool, sinking into his bones. His limbs grew stiff, his mind sluggish. Doubt, the most insidious cold of all, began to creep in. He was a fool, chasing ghosts in a hurricane of snow. They could be anywhere. They could already be. He refused to complete the thought. He pictured Grace's face, peaceful and full after a feeding. He pictured Clara's quiet smile as she worked on Sarah's quilt. These images were his fire, the only thing keeping the encroaching despair at bay. He had lost one family to the cruel indifference of fate. He would not lose another to the cruel meddling of other people. It was Buck who saved them. The horse suddenly stopped, his head held high, his ears twitching. He snorted, a plume of steam erupting from his nostrils, and tried to shy away from a thick copse of pine trees huddled against a low, rocky outcrop. "What is it, boy?" Ethan squinted, trying to pierce the veil of snow. At first, he saw nothing, just the dark trunks of the pines and the looming shape of the rock face. But there, at the base of the rocks, was a shadow, a slight depression in the snow that didn't look natural. It looked like a hollow, the entrance to an old wolf den or a bear's winter lair. He slid from the saddle, his legs numb and clumsy. He stumbled through the deep drift, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He pushed aside a heavy, snow-laden pine bough, and there she was. Clara was huddled in the shallow opening of the den, a small, pathetic shelter from the storm's full fury. She was a frozen statue, crusted in snow, her body curled tightly around the precious bundle in her arms. Her head was slumped forward, her face ashen and waxy in the dim light. She was shivering, a deep, convulsive trembling that shook her entire frame. "Clara," he breathed, the name a plume of white vapor. Her head lifted slowly. Her eyes were unfocused, glazed with the first stages of delirium. They stared at him, through him, not seeming to recognize who he was. She saw only a shape, a threat. She instinctively tightened her hold on Grace, a low, animalistic moan coming from her blue-tinged lips. He reached for them, and she flinched violently away from his touch. "No," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, barely audible over the wind. "No, you can't. She's a good baby. She's done nothing wrong." Ethan's heart shattered. She wasn't talking to him. She was talking to the ghosts of Sage Creek, to Martha Gable and the whispering church ladies. He knelt in the snow in front of her, his own desperate need to get them to safety, warring with the need to break through her terror. "Clara, it's me. It's Ethan." She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. Tears froze on her cheeks. "Please," she begged, her words tumbling out in a desperate, incoherent plea. "Don't take her. Don't let them take her from me. It's my fault. I know it's my fault. But don't punish her for it. Please, just leave her be." She was going to die out here, protecting a child she believed she had no right to, from a danger that existed only in the poison that had been dripped into her ear. In that moment, all the unspoken truths of the past months, all the cautious boundaries and guarded fears, were ripped away by the storm. He saw not a stranger, not a temporary arrangement, but the woman who had walked out of a blizzard to save his world, and who was now about to be consumed by another one because she believed she wasn't worthy of what she had done. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, his movements firm but gentle, and gathered both of them into his arms. He pulled Clara and the precious bundle of Grace against his chest, shielding them with his own body. Clara struggled weakly at first, a panicked bird in a cage, but he held her fast. He pressed his face into her icy hair, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice a low, urgent rumble against her ear. "No one is taking her. Not from me. Not from you." He felt a sob shake her body. "But they said I wasn't decent." He pulled back just enough to look into her delirious eyes, forcing her to see him. "They don't know anything," he said, his words raw with a fierce, absolute conviction. He looked down at the sleeping, miraculously warm face of his daughter, nestled between them. "You didn't take anything from this house. You came into a home that was dying, and you brought it back to life." He looked back at Clara, his gaze holding hers. "You didn't take anything," he repeated, his voice breaking. "You gave her life." The words, a simple, profound truth, finally pierced the fog of her fear and delirium. Her frantic struggling ceased. Her haunted eyes cleared for a moment, and she saw him not as a threat, but as Ethan. A look of utter, heartbreaking exhaustion washed over her face. The fight went out of her, and she slumped against him, her shivering body finally surrendering to his warmth and strength. He held them both, a man who had thought himself utterly alone, now with the entire weight of his world in his arms. The wind shrieked around them. The snow fell, but in the small, desperate shelter of the den, huddled together against the cold of the world, a fragile, broken, and beautiful family was finally, truly born. Part 6. The Debt Collector and the Gun. The aftermath of the storm was a rebirth. The world was scoured clean, and inside the cabin, the emotional landscape had been similarly altered. The cautious, fragile truce they had maintained for months was gone, swept away by the blizzard and Ethan's desperate search. In its place grew a quiet, powerful certainty. He had not just brought her back from the storm. He had claimed her, and she, in her terror, had shown him the depth of her devotion not just to Grace, but to the idea of their fragile home. The ghosts of Sarah and Thomas did not vanish, but they no longer sat at the table between them. Instead, they receded, becoming gentle, sorrowful memories that formed the foundation upon which this new, unexpected life was being built. A new rhythm was established, one of ease and unspoken understanding. Ethan found himself talking more, sharing small details of his day, asking about hers. He would watch her with Grace, not with the old fear of loss, but with a swelling sense of rightness. Clara, in turn, began to lose the hunted look in her eyes. A real smile would touch her lips when Grace gurgled, and she no longer flinched from Ethan's presence, but seemed to draw a quiet strength from it. Their life was still hard. The land demanded constant toil, but it was no longer a lonely struggle. They worked as a unit, a silent partnership forged in grief and necessity. now tempered by a growing, unspoken affection. The town and its whispers became a distant noise, a bad dream from which they had both awakened. They had their world within the 4 log walls of the cabin, and, for a time, it felt like enough. But the outside world could not be held at bay forever. It arrived on a hot afternoon in late summer, when the air was thick with the scent of pine and dust. It arrived in the form of 3 riders, who crested the hill overlooking the ranch not with the meandering pace of travelers, but with the grim purpose of men on a mission. Ethan was by the barn, mending a split fence rail. When he saw them, he straightened up, his hands shading his eyes, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. They weren't neighbors. Their clothes were too fine for this part of the country, their horses too sleek. Clara came to the cabin door, Grace balanced on her hip, drawn by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She stood there, a silent question in her eyes. Ethan gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head and gestured for her to go back inside. She obeyed without a word, her trust in him absolute. The 3 men reined in their horses a few yards from where Ethan stood, kicking up a cloud of fine dust. The man in the center was the leader. He was dressed in a dark city suit, his face clean-shaven and pale, with cold, intelligent eyes that took in everything: the state of the barn, the small vegetable patch Clara had planted, the smoke curling from the cabin chimney with a calculating air. The 2 men flanking him were of a different sort. They were large and brutish, with sun-scorched faces and the dull, impassive expressions of men paid to follow orders. Their hands rested casually on the butts of the pistols holstered at their hips. Ethan Cole, the leader, asked. His voice was smooth, educated, and utterly out of place in the rustic quiet of the ranch. "I am," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble. He did not move from his spot, the fence post he'd been sharpening still in his hand, its pointed end a crude but effective weapon. The man dismounted with a fluid, easy motion. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a sheaf of papers. "My name is Sterling," he said, extending the documents. "I represent the Wyoming Land and Cattle Conglomerate out of Cheyenne. I'm afraid I have some unpleasant business regarding this property." Ethan didn't take the papers. "This property is mine. There's no business to be had." A thin, condescending smile touched Sterling's lips. "That's where you're mistaken. Mr. Cole, this property was put up as collateral against a rather substantial loan, a loan taken out by your brother, Jacob Cole." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Jacob, his older brother, a man full of grand schemes and empty promises, who had drifted through Ethan's life like a bad wind. He hadn't seen or heard from him in over 2 years, not since Jacob had left for the silver fields in Colorado, swearing he'd come back a rich man. "The loan, I'm sorry to say, is in default," Sterling continued, enjoying the effect his words were having, "and your brother, it seems, has vanished. Which means, according to this legally binding contract, this land, the cabin, the barn, every last acre reverts to my employer." He gestured vaguely at the horizon. "Effective immediately." "No," Ethan said. "The word flat and final? This is my land. I filed the claim. I built that house with Sarah, with my wife." "An unfortunate situation," Sterling said with a complete lack of sympathy. "But your brother's signature is on the document. The law is the law. We are here to take possession. I suggest you gather your personal effects and vacate the premises." The cabin door creaked open again. Clara stood there, her face a pale mask of fear. Grace held tightly against her shoulder. Sterling's cold eyes flickered toward her, and his thin smile widened. He saw what he expected to see: a complication, a weakness. "I see you have dependents," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. "All the more reason to avoid any unnecessary trouble. Wouldn't you agree?" The veiled threat, the dismissive, scornful way he looked at Clara and Grace, was a spark on dry tinder. The rage that had been simmering in Ethan's gut ignited. "You'll get off my land," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a deliberate step forward, planting his feet. Sterling's smile vanished. He gave a curt nod to his men. The two brutes dismounted, their movements slow and menacing. They began to walk forward, fanning out, their intent clear. This was no longer a legal matter. It was a physical eviction. The hard way, then. Sterling sighed, as if bored by the predictability of it all. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned and strode purposefully back to the cabin. Sterling and his men paused, expecting him to be gathering his things. Instead, he reappeared in the doorway a moment later, the long, dark barrel of his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Clara had stepped back from the doorway but was still visible just behind him, a silent, defiant shadow. The two enforcers stopped dead, their hands hovering over their pistols. The air grew thick and heavy with the promise of violence. It was a classic Western standoff, played out under the hot Wyoming sun. "I said," Ethan repeated, his voice now a clear, hard-edged thing that cut through the silence. "Get off my land." Sterling held up a hand, a look of annoyance on his face. "Mr. Cole, be reasonable. It is 3 against 1. Do you really want your, companion and that child to witness what happens next?" But it was no longer 3 against 1. From the direction of the town, another sound emerged, the rhythmic beat of more horses. A small group of riders appeared over the rise. It was Silas, the blacksmith, his big arms bare to the elbow. It was old Mr. Abernathy, who ranched the next section over. There were 3 or 4 others, men Ethan knew by sight, men who had been part of the Whispers, who had watched him with suspicion in their eyes. They had likely seen Sterling and his men ride through town and, driven by that same frontier curiosity, had followed to see what business a man in a suit had with the grieving widower. Ethan Cole. They reined in their horses a respectful distance away, not taking sides, but simply watching, their faces grim, their presence transformed the encounter. It was no longer a private dispute on an isolated ranch. It was a community affair. Sterling, sensing the shift, tried to seize control of the narrative. He turned to the newcomers, his voice projecting an air of authority. "Gentlemen, there's no need for concern. This is a simple legal matter. This man is a squatter on property owned by my employer. He's living here in sin with this woman, on land that doesn't belong to him. The law is on my side." It was his final, fatal mistake. He had brought the town's ugly whispers out into the open, intending to use them as a weapon to shame and isolate Ethan. But in the face of a direct, physical threat from outsiders, the whispers suddenly seemed petty and small. Ethan stood unflinching on his porch. He looked from Sterling's smug face to the watching, uncertain eyes of his neighbors. Then he glanced over his shoulder at Clara, who was watching him with a look of terrified faith, and at his daughter, Grace, who was staring wide-eyed at the strangers. Everything he had, everything he had almost lost and fought to regain, was standing right behind him. He planted his feet, the worn wood of the porch groaning beneath his boots. He raised his chin, his gaze clear and unwavering as he faced the men from town and from Cheyenne. "This land is mine," he said, his voice ringing with a power and conviction that silenced the prairie. "I built this house with my own 2 hands and buried my wife on that hill over there. And you will not set 1 foot inside it." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Sterling and his thugs, before finally settling on them. "You will not threaten my family." The words "my family" were a thunderclap in the hot summer air. It was a public declaration, a line drawn not just in the dust of his yard, but in the social fabric of Sage Creek. It was a defiant claim, thrown in the face of their gossip and their judgment. In that single, possessive phrase, he reframed their entire world. Clara was not some fallen woman trading her body for a roof. She was his. Grace was not just his child, but theirs. They were a family. The shift among the townsmen was subtle. but unmistakable. Mr. Abernathy, who had been sitting slumped in his saddle, straightened up. Silas the blacksmith shifted his weight, and his hand, thick with muscle and soot, dropped to rest on the handle of the large horse pistol tucked into his belt. None of them drew a weapon. None of them spoke a word, but a message had been sent. Ethan Cole might be a stubborn, quiet man who kept to himself, but he was one of them. Sterling and his men were not. Sterling saw it. The arrogant certainty drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He was a businessman who used the threat of violence as a tool. A gunfight with a lone, desperate rancher was one thing. A potential bloodbath with half the armed men in the county was a terrible miscalculation. He plastered the false smile back on his face. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he said, backing slowly toward his horse. "We'll take this up with the territorial marshal." He swung himself into the saddle, his two thugs quickly following suit. "This isn't over." "Cole," he snarled, the threat sounding hollow and weak. They spurred their horses and rode away, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust. Ethan stood perfectly still until they were out of sight. The Winchester held steady at his side. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. Silas the blacksmith rode his horse a few steps closer. He looked at the rifle in Ethan's hand, at the cabin, and then at Ethan. That was a damn fool thing to do. "Cole," he said, his voice a low grumble. He paused, then spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "But you did right." It was all he said. It was enough. It was an absolution, an acceptance. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and the other men followed, leaving as quietly as they had come. Ethan finally lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly immense. He turned back to the doorway. Clara was standing there, her face streaked with tears. But these were not the tears of fear or sorrow he had seen before. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. He had not only defended their home, he had named them, claimed them, and given them a place in the world, right here on this small, embattled piece of land. He stepped back inside the cabin, pulling the door shut, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the house felt truly, completely full. Part 7. The Seed of Life. 3 years. In the West, 3 years was a lifetime. It was long enough for a river to change its course, for a boomtown to turn to dust, for a memory to soften from a sharp-edged wound into a dull, familiar ache. On the ranch at Sage Creek. 3 years had been long enough for a house to become a home. The land itself seemed to have exhaled, relaxing under a new sense of permanence. The cabin no longer felt like a lonely outpost against the wilderness, but the warm, beating heart of it. A sturdy new porch ran along the front, built by Ethan's hands, its wood already silvering in the sun. A vegetable garden, twice the size of the first, flourished under Clara's patient care, its neat rows of beans, squash, and corn a testament to her nurturing touch. The barn had a new coat of whitewash, and the fences ran straight and true. The ranch was no longer a place of mere survival. It was a place of life. The most vibrant proof of that life came in the form of a small, chattering whirlwind with Sarah's stormy blue eyes and a stubborn chin that was all Ethan. Grace was no longer a fragile infant, but a sturdy 3-year-old who ran on tireless, chubby legs, her laughter the constant soundtrack of their days. She was a child of the prairie, her skin browned by the sun, her dark hair a wild tangle that Clara was forever trying to tame with a ribbon. She called Ethan Papa in a clear, piping voice, and she called Clara Mama with a simple, absolute certainty that had long ago healed the last of the deep cracks in Clara's heart. The man who had once been a prisoner of his own grief was now Grace's willing captive. Ethan, the hard, silent rancher, had been irrevocably softened. The deep lines of sorrow around his eyes had been replaced by crow's feet, carved by squinting into the sun and smiling at his daughter's antics. He would come in from a long day of mending fences or tending the herd and scoop Grace into his arms, lifting her so high her head nearly brushed the ceiling beams, her squeals of delight echoing in the small cabin. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. A gentle hand on Clara's back as he passed her at the stove. The small bouquet of prairie wildflowers he'd leave on the table for her. The way he would sit on the porch steps in the evening, watching her and Grace. A look of quiet, profound wonder on his face. Clara, too, was transformed. The haunted, grieving woman who had stumbled out of a storm had found her footing on this solid piece of earth. The ghosts of her past no longer walked beside her. The memory of her son, Thomas, was now a gentle sadness, a quiet corner of her heart she could visit without being consumed by it. She had found a purpose that was not a substitute for what she had lost, but a new and wondrous thing in its own right. She was the calm center of their world, her quiet strength the loom upon which the fabric of their family was woven. Her love for Grace was a fierce, protective sun, and her affection for Ethan was a deep, steady river, growing more powerful with each passing season. One bright morning in early autumn, after the first frost had sharpened the air and turned the distant aspen groves to rivers of gold, Ethan came back from the tree line, not with game, but with a small, carefully wrapped bundle of burlap. "What have you got there?" Papa Grace asked, running to meet him, her steps unsteady in the dirt. Ethan knelt and unwrapped his prize. It was a tiny tree, a sapling no taller than Grace herself, its roots balled in damp earth. Its needles were a soft, healthy green. "It's a white pine," he said, his rough finger gently touching one of the branches. Clara came to stand beside them, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's beautiful, Ethan, but what's it for?" Ethan looked up at her. Then his gaze swept over the ranch, the cabin, the barn, the hill where Sarah was buried, the vast, open sky. "This place, our home, it needs roots," he said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "Something to mark that we're here, that we've held on." He looked back at the sapling. "White pines are the strongest things I know. I've seen them up in the high country, bent over double by the winter wind. Buried in snow so deep you'd think nothing could live, but come spring, they straighten right up and keep growing. The wind can't break them, the storms can't kill them." Clara understood. It was a monument not to what they had lost, but to what they had endured. He had already chosen the spot, a small, protected patch of ground just inside the fence line, where they could see it from the cabin window. He dug the hole with the same care he would use to build a foundation, his shovel slicing cleanly into the rich, dark earth. The planting was a ceremony, a family ritual. Ethan gently lowered the sapling into the hole. Clara knelt beside him, steadying the thin trunk with her hands, ensuring it stood straight and true. "All right, Gracie," Ethan said, looking at his daughter. "It's your turn. Every root needs a home." He gave her a small hand trowel, and Grace, her face a mask of solemn concentration, scooped up a small pile of dirt and dumped it into the hole around the roots. She patted it down with her small hands. Together, the three of them filled the rest of the hole, their hands working in the cool soil. Ethan tamped the earth down firmly, then went to the well for a bucket of water. He poured it slowly, a life-giving blessing for their small, living symbol. They stood back to admire their work. The tiny tree looked fragile and small against the vastness of the prairie and the sky, but it stood straight and proud. It was a promise, a seed of hope planted in the soil of their shared history. "It will grow with her," Clara said softly, her hand finding Ethan's, their fingers intertwined. A familiar, comfortable gesture. "It will," Ethan agreed. "It'll be here long after we're gone." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the small tree, The afternoon sun was warm on their backs. Grace, her duty done, was now chasing a grasshopper through the tall grass near the fence. Clara's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "Ethan," she began, her voice a little hesitant, There's another seed that's been planted." He turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. She was not looking at the tree, but at her own stomach. She placed her free hand over her abdomen, a gesture of profound, protective tenderness. Her gaze, when she lifted it to meet his, was shining with a mixture of joy and a faint, familiar tremor of fear. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered. "Come the spring." The world seemed to stop. The sound of the wind, the buzz of the insects, Grace's distant laughter, it all faded away. Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of her words. A baby, their baby. Not a child of grief and necessity, but a child of love and choice, conceived in the quiet peace they had built together. It was a future he had never, in his wildest, most desperate dreams, allowed himself to imagine. He looked from her radiant face to her hand resting on her stomach, and a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. He saw it all in a flash, a new cradle beside Grace's bed, 2 small children running through the grass. This house filled to the brim with a life and a love so immense it felt impossible. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate. He simply reached out his other hand and covered hers, his large, calloused palm resting over her womb. He could feel the faint, steady pulse of her life beneath his touch, and beneath that, the tiny, miraculous secret of a new life beginning. The hard, stoic rancher who had faced down blizzards and armed men finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek and fell onto their joined hands. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming it was painful. "Clara," he breathed, his voice thick and unrecognizable. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. He was no longer just a man who had survived. He was a man who had been given a second chance at everything. From across the yard, Grace, seeing her parents embracing, let out a whoop of delight and came running toward them, her small arms outstretched. Ethan scooped her up with one arm, holding her tight against them. His family, his entire world, wrapped in one embrace. They stood there for a long time, the 3 of them, a portrait of impossible happiness, silhouetted against the setting sun, with a small, resilient pine tree standing sentinel beside them, its roots taking hold in the rich, dark earth. Partum. The promise of the West. The winter that followed was nothing like the one that had almost claimed them. The wind still shrieked its mournful song around the corners of the cabin, and the snow still fell in thick, silent blankets. But inside, the world was no longer a landscape of grief. It was a sanctuary of warmth and anticipation. The fire in the hearth was no longer a sullen, dying thing, but a roaring, cheerful blaze that cast a golden light on the faces of a family. Ethan would sit in his chair, mending a harness or oiling his rifle, but his eyes would constantly drift to Clara. She would be in Sarah's old rocking chair, not as a visitor, but as its rightful mistress, her hands busy knitting impossibly small garments from soft, white yarn. Her belly was a gentle, swelling curve under her apron, a constant, miraculous promise of the spring to come. Grace, now old enough to understand the change, was a vessel of endless curiosity. She would climb onto Clara's lap, her small hand resting gently on the curve of her mother's stomach. "Is the baby sleeping?" "Mama," she would ask, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I think so, sweet girl," Clara would whisper back, her smile soft and radiant in the firelight. "When the baby comes out, can I teach it to chase grasshoppers?" "You can teach the baby anything you want," Ethan would rumble from his chair, a deep, contented laugh in his chest. In these quiet moments, Ethan saw the full measure of what they had built. This was not a life he had planned or expected. It was a life that had grown out of the ashes of another, a hardy, resilient thing, like the white pine sapling outside their window, which was now spending its first winter standing firm against the storms. He had not replaced Sarah. The love he had for his first wife was a thing apart, a sealed and sacred chamber in his heart. The love he felt for Clara was a new structure, built on a different foundation of shared survival, mutual respect, and a deep, quiet tenderness that had taken root and grown into something as strong and vital as any love born of youthful passion. He had learned that a heart, like the land itself, was vast enough to hold more than one season, more than one harvest. The town of Sage Creek had changed, too. Ethan's stand against Sterling had become the stuff of local legend. The whispers had died, shamed into silence by his public declaration. When Ethan rode into town now, the nods were no longer hesitant, but firm and respectful. Martha Gable would offer a curt but civil greeting, her eyes no longer holding scorn, but a grudging admiration. They had been shown a truth they could not deny. What they had mistaken for sin was, in fact, a fierce and uncompromising love. The West respected strength above all else, and Ethan and Clara had shown a strength of spirit that had outlasted gossip and defied threats. When the final snows melted and the land was once again alive with the sound of rushing water and the scent of damp earth, a new tension, one of hope and anxiety, filled the cabin. Clara grew heavy and tired, her movements slow and deliberate. Ethan watched her with a hawk's eye, his fear of loss a deeply buried but ever-present shadow. He had been helpless when the fever took Sarah. He would not be helpless again. He had spoken at length with the doctor's wife, a humble and contrite woman now, who had given him a long list of instructions and supplies. The baby chose to arrive on a warm night in May, when the sky was awash with a sea of brilliant stars. The labor was long and hard, a trial of endurance that Clara met with a quiet, gritting fortitude that humbled Ethan. He was by her side the entire time. He bathed her face with cool water, held her hand in a grip so tight their bones seemed to fuse, and murmured words of encouragement, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of pain. Grace was asleep in her small bed, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding just a few feet away. In the deepest, darkest hour before the dawn, with the cabin lit only by a single flickering lantern, their son was born. He entered the world not with a weak, fretful cry, but a robust, angry wail, his small, perfect face red and crumpled, his tiny fists already balled in defiance. Ethan cut the cord with a steady hand, his heart a wild, joyous drum against his ribs. He washed the baby gently in a basin of warm water and wrapped him in one of the soft blankets Clara had knitted. He brought the squalling bundle to the bed and laid him in Clara's waiting arms. The moment Clara held her son, a profound and holy silence fell over the room. All the pain, all the fear, all the years of sorrow melted away. She looked down at the small, fierce face, and the tears that streamed down her cheeks were not of grief, but of a joy so complete it was a kind of grace. She looked at Ethan, her eyes shining with a love that was bottomless. "He looks like you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He has your stubborn chin." Ethan knelt by the bed, his large, rough hand touching the baby's cheek with a reverence he usually reserved for prayer. He saw his own features there, but he also saw something of Clara in the shape of his eyes, and in the fierce, determined set of his mouth. He saw the spirit of this land, of survival, of a life that would not be denied. "What will we name him?" Ethan asked, his voice thick. Clara didn't hesitate. She looked from her newborn son to the man kneeling beside her. "Samuel," she said, "it means God has heard." It was the perfect name. God had heard the desperate, unspoken prayers of two broken people in a lonely cabin. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and beautiful days. The cabin, which had once felt so cavernous and empty, was now filled to bursting with life. Samuel was a strong, healthy baby. And Grace was a doting, if sometimes overly enthusiastic, older sister. One evening in the autumn, as the days grew shorter and the air grew crisp, the family was gathered by the fire. Samuel was asleep in the cradle Ethan had built, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Grace was on the bearskin rug, carefully arranging a line of pebbles, chattering to them as if they were her students. Clara was in her rocking chair, her mending in her lap, a look of deep, peaceful contentment on her face. Ethan watched them, his heart so full he felt it might break. He looked around the cabin at the sturdy log walls that had sheltered them, at the hearth that had warmed them, at the worn floorboards that had borne the weight of their sorrows and their joys. This was more than a house. It was a living testament to their journey. He rose from his chair and went to the mantelpiece. He took down the sharp, well-honed hunting knife he used for skinning game. Clara looked up, a question in her eyes. He didn't speak, but walked to the center of the room and looked up at the main ceiling beam, the thick, solid piece of timber that was the spine of the house. It was the same beam he had set in place with Sarah years ago, full of dreams for a future that had never come to be. He took a small wooden crate and placed it under the beam, stepping up onto it. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, he began to carve into the wood. The knife bit deep, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the air. He worked with intense concentration, the muscles in his forearm taut. First, he carved his own name, Ethan. Then, beside it, he carved the name of the woman who had saved him, Clara. He stepped down and looked at his daughter, who had stopped her game and was now watching him with wide, curious eyes. He smiled and carved her name next Grace. Finally, he looked at the cradle, at the son who was the living proof of their new beginning. He carved the last name, completing the line. Samuel. He stepped back and looked at his work, the 4 names, etched deep into the heartwood of the home, stark and permanent. They were not a replacement for the names that had come before. They were an addition, a new chapter carved into the same book. This was his family, a family born not of blood, but of choice, a family forged in a blizzard, tested by gossip, and sealed by a love that had proven as resilient and stubborn as a white pine in a winter storm. Clara came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his. She looked up at the names on the beam. Then she looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. In her gaze, he saw the promise of all their tomorrows, a future as wide and open as the western sky. They hadn't found what they were looking for out here in this wild, unforgiving country, but in the wreckage of their old lives, in the heart of the deepest sorrow. They had found something they never knew they needed. They had found each other, and that, he knew, was the truest promise of the West. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and hit the hype button to help more people discover this tale.